as a companion video to the video I made talking about the negative effects of the PS1 on the gaming industry. In this video, I'll be talking about what made the PS1 so awesome. Because, like I said in that video, I really like the PS1, and I know that for some of you, it's your favorite system of all time, or somewhere up there. And if you don't like the PS1, that's okay too, because maybe this video will help you to give it more of a chance. I know a lot of people gave it a chance, their first chance they gave it was with the PS1 Classic. Bad idea, because that thing was a piece of crap, at least compared to what it could have been. They did a really sloppy job with that. And the main problem with that thing was just the game selection they had with it. They were missing all kinds of great games for the PS1. And a lot of that is just because the PS1 has so many good games. But there was some really obvious stuff missing on that thing. But anyways, yeah, that's the first thing that makes the PS1 so awesome. It's just there's so many different kinds of games. This thing had tons of games, and yeah, a lot of them are crap. That just goes with the territory of having such a large library. But if you really dig around and look, I really think there's something for everybody on the PS1. For example, I'm a big fan of sprite-based and 2D games, and so there's a lot of games. I mean, half of the games that I own for the PS1 are 2D games, even though they weren't really emphasized back then. But compared to the N64, which basically had no 2D games at all, the PS1 actually had a pretty decent amount. Okay, so why did the PS1 have so many great games? Well, it's simple but brilliant. What Sony did with the PlayStation 1 is just make it really easy for developers to develop for. That's really it, and they got a ton of third-party support because of that. The architecture of the system was easy to design for compared to the Sega Saturn, and it used discs, which developers wanted because it was cheaper and you could fit way more storage on them compared to the Nintendo 64, which had cartridges, which were a lot more expensive to make, and you couldn't fit as much data on them. So Sega Saturn was hard to develop for, and the Nintendo 64 didn't have discs. So just by process of elimination, the PlayStation 1 was just the place to go to make your games. But even more than that, Sony promoted different kinds of games in order to, really sell their brand of being the console for more mature gamers. Games like Resident Evil and Metal Gear Solid, I like to mention those games a lot. Silent Hill, stuff like that. Even something like Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, that really fit in with their brand of being for like older, cooler types of kids or teenagers or young adults or whatever. Alright, but let's talk about Crash Bandicoot. Crash Bandicoot was a game I kept going back to talk about in my video where I was critical of the PlayStation 1. And the problem I had with it is that it acted like Mario was far more kiddie and babyish compared to Crash Bandicoot, when really I feel like they're pretty similar as far as how colorful and family friendly and all that kind of stuff. I mean, they're both mascot platformers. But I do think it's important that what the PlayStation did was they had games that we had been playing already all along. Stuff like mascot platformers and role-playing games and shoot-'em-ups and all this stuff like that. And they actually made them seem cool because they just blended in with the Sony brand so much, and people thought, well, if it's on PlayStation, then it's okay because PlayStation is a more mature console. So in kind of a weird way, they actually helped promote these games. And I think that's really the most important thing they did, is they brought in this new audience of people who discovered that they really loved video games and all kinds of video games, not just the more, quote unquote mature branded games that Sony was promoting. I mean, I'm sure there were people like that, but it's different from the Wii, where a lot of the casual, people we call casual gamers who came in for the Wii kind of went away once they got over the whole motion control phase. But with the PS1, I really feel like a lot of those gamers stuck around because they realized, hey, video games are awesome, and it's not just, Resident Evil and Tony Hawk and more mature stuff like that. They thought like, man, I love stuff like the Mega Man X series or role-playing games. That was a huge one. I mean, look what Final Fantasy VII did for role-playing games in the West. They made that genre seem huge. So I think that's really what's important. The most important thing the PS1 did is they brought in a lot of people who genuinely loved video games, and obviously that's an awesome thing and something I can really get behind. And that was also really helpful because it got rid of this stigma of video games being this thing for, you know, dorks or nerds or kids or whatever. So the people who had already been playing video games, even though, as I talked about in my last video, it might have been kind of weird seeing all these new people come into their space, it did make it less, you know, a more acceptable thing to do. And that's kind of cool, you know, to see video games thrive and do well, even if, you know, some of those changes I talked about aren't, you know, good things, but it is cool to see video games become this more legitimate thing. I mean, video games becoming a more accepted form of media is always going to be a goal of mine. Think about it. Sony, so they're not a video game company, and they came in and they made it seem like a more legitimate thing. Like it's not just something that video game companies do, because, you know, the two big players at the time were Sega and Nintendo. Atari had kind of fallen off by that point, but it was basically just video game companies for the most part making video games. Those were all the most prominent names. So Sony coming in, being, you know, just an electronics company that was known for doing other stuff, and, you know, sticking the CD player in there, and they've had this kind of history of always sticking some sort of multimedia player into their consoles. With the PS2, it was DVDs was a big deal. With PS3s, it was the Blu-ray, which is a big deal. So they've kind of like, you know, helped expand the market for video games, where it's considered a more legitimate form of media. And this was all reflected in the video games themselves. Having that CD drive so that games could be on CDs and hold all this data meant that stuff like FMVs and, you know, voice recordings for actual voice acting, Metal Gear Solid is a big one that sticks in my mind, you know, as one that actually had voice acting. Not everything had great voice acting at that time. But, you know, these were the baby steps. These were the foundational steps for something like that, so that games could have more of a narrative, movie-like aspect into them. And so I know not everybody likes that in their video games. People don't, you know, the whole criticism of this is a video game, or this is a movie, not a video game. I get that, but there are a lot of people who do like to have that very heavy narrative aspect in at least some of their video games. I'm kind of that way. I don't want all the video games to be that way, but, you know, a few here and there is good. But anyways, that was huge for evolving video games. So anyways, those are some of my thoughts on some of the positive things that PS1 did for video games. I know I did that video on the negative things too, but I try to provide a balanced perspective where I can see both sides of things. Hopefully a lot of you see that that's what I'm trying to do with this channel, is always be as fair as I can. So anyways, let me know what you think. I know a lot of you didn't write comments on the video where I was negative about the PS1, and, you know, I understand that. But now's your chance to gush about the PS1 if you want to do so. So anyways, leave those comments down below. I'd love to hear what y'all have to say. And if you didn't see the video where I talk about the negative things about the PS1, that's probably worth a watch too, especially if you watch that one and this one together, so you get that entire full perspective. So anyways, leave those comments down below, and I will see ya in the next video.